of my favorite stories to include was from the prophet Joel. Now, Joel sometimes is one of the minor prophets, which sort of sounds like a diss, but it just meant that he's one of the prophets whose books were shorter than the ones that we're more familiar with, like Isaiah or Jeremiah. But here's why I wanted to include this story from Joel. So for starters, it begins with saying that God's word came to Joel, and there's this instruction that each generation should tell it to their children, and their children would tell it to their children. I sort of loved that notion of intergenerational biblical storytelling that was right there in the passage. And there's this succession of plagues of locusts. They're the cutting locusts, and then the swarming locusts, and the hopping locusts, and the destroying locusts. And so it was fun to sort of imagine what sounds did those bugs make, and what would it mean to read those, make those sounds with your children as you're reading through the story. But then, for all that fun of making the noises, it does lead to this big question, which is, in the passage, the people think that these disasters, disaster upon disaster upon disaster, were their fault. They thought they were to blame. They thought that God was punishing them. And so the story really gives us an opportunity to say, absolutely, the people thought that they were to blame, that when bad things happened, it was their fault and it was God's punishment. But that wasn't really true. We know that even though it's easy to feel that way, that it's not God punishing us. And then what I love is that the story goes on to say that part of the promise at the end of the story is that God's Spirit will be upon young and old and all genders to prophesy. And so it's this invitation for children, as they hear the story, to realize that they can be prophets too. And then I sort of began imagining what might the young people have prophesied back then. And then it ends with a question to the children: well, what big ideas do you have to share about living God's way? And so a minor prophet with a mighty message. And I sort of